In the summer of 64 AD, as the eternal city of Rome was consumed by flames, witnesses claimed they saw a silhouette against the inferno, Emperor Nero, watching the dance of fire and singing. That image would endure for centuries as a symbol of both horror and fascination. But who was this man? How did the figure who turned the heart of civilization into a stage for humanity's darkest impulses come to be? His story fuses madness with brilliance, the tragedy of a son who killed his mother, and the corruption born from absolute power. Nero's tale is not merely that of a tyrant, but an exploration of how the human soul collapses when faced with limitless authority. His reign began in hope, but became engraved in Roman history as the embodiment of moral decay and blood-stained grandeur. His name became synonymous with tyranny. His legacy was written in ashes, death, and fear. The man who would become the most controversial ruler of the Roman Empire was born into a world where family bonds were shattered by ambition. In the imperial court, trust was replaced by poison, affection by manipulation. Nero learned the language of this world early and in time, spoke it more fluently than anyone else. Born as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in AD 37, during the reign of the mad Emperor Caligula, Nero carried the blood of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His destiny was sealed from birth. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, died when Nero was 3 years old, leaving the boy in the care of his mother, Agrippina the younger. Agrippina was no ordinary Roman woman. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula, daughter of the beloved general Germanicus, and possessed a beauty matched only by her ruthless intelligence. After returning from exile, she seduced Emperor Claudius, who had taken the throne in 41 AD, and re-established her power in Rome. Her rise was a masterpiece of manipulation. She destroyed her rivals through lies and ruled her allies through fear. Nero grew up amid these intrigues. He watched his mother charm Claudius, sacrifice family and friends for power, and turn murder into a political instrument. In his eyes, violence was not a crime, it was a form of governance. This environment shaped Nero's character. He learned that it was better to instill fear than to trust, better to command than to love. Agrippina raised her son not as a child, but as an instrument of her ambition. Her choice of Seneca as his tutor was strategic. The exiled philosopher owed her his recall and position. Seneca tried to teach Nero virtue and moderation, unaware that he was guiding a monster in the making. One of Rome's greatest moral philosophers had become the mentor of one of history's most depraved rulers. The path to becoming Claudius's heir required removing one obstacle: the emperor's biological son, Britannicus. Through relentless manipulation, Agrippina convinced Claudius to adopt Nero. By AD, Nero bore the title Princeps Juventutis, Prince of Youth, and stood in the shadow of the throne. Then, in AD 54, Claudius suddenly died after a dinner. The official record cited mushroom poisoning, but historians agree it was murder. According to legend, Agrippina entrusted the task to her servant Locusta, a master poisoner. Claudius died shortly after naming Nero as his successor, and Rome hailed its new emperor. At just 16, Nero ascended the throne. Under the guidance of Seneca and Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, his early reign seemed promising. His speeches to the Senate echoed Augustus's principles. The people adored their young ruler. Yet beneath the surface, a different story was unfolding. His relationship with Agrippina quickly soured. The empress mother expected to rule through her son, but Nero had no intention of living in her shadow. Their conflict reenacted an ancient drama, the struggle between the woman who gave power and the son who seized it. Soon, the first drop of blood that would stain Rome's destiny was spilled. In AD 55, Britannicus, Nero's 14-year-old stepbrother, was poisoned during dinner. The same Locusta prepared the toxin. The boy collapsed after sipping his wine, foam spilling from his mouth as guests screamed in terror. Nero showed no emotion. He ordered the meal to continue. The death was declared an epileptic seizure, but everyone knew the truth. That night, Nero ceased to be a puppet and became a tyrant. Rome no longer had a mere emperor, it had a monster growing in the darkness of its own making. Nero's plan was as intricate as a stage play, and as grotesque as madness itself. Agrippina had to believe she was finally reconciled with her son, for in the imperial court, death often began with an embrace. That night, at a lavish banquet held on the Bay of Bai, Nero treated his mother with an affection that astonished everyone. He seated her in the place of highest honor, offered her lavish gifts, and even raised his cup while gazing into her eyes. Everything seemed to signal that years of tension had at last come to an end. As dawn approached, Agrippina boarded the special boat Nero had prepared for her return home. The vessel glided smoothly over the calm night waters until, just minutes later, it silently split apart and began to sink. As the architects had planned, the ship appeared to collapse, as though struck by a sudden storm. But something unforeseen occurred. Agrippina survived. She was a strong swimmer, and amid the screams of her drowning servants, she reached the shore, exhausted, but alive. And she understood at once. Her son had tried to kill her. The failed assassination drove Nero to the brink of madness. He spent the night pacing in terror, imagining first his mother's ghost, then an army of avengers coming to destroy him. Yet Agrippina, astonishingly, remained silent. She made no public accusation, no attempt to rally support, a silence that only fueled the rumors spreading through Rome. Nero realized that he now had to silence both his mother and the whispers. The following night, the guards Nero had dispatched arrived at Agrippina's villa. The emperor's order was clear, though never written: finish the accident. When Agrippina saw the soldiers, she knew instantly why they had come. According to legend, her final words would echo through history: if you come by my son's command, then strike here in my womb. For it was there that the monster was born. The soldier raised his spear. Her words hung in the air like a curse, and with that blow, one of the most horrifying scenes in Roman history unfolded. When the news reached Nero, he was silent for a moment, then began to laugh. It was the laughter of terror and release. Agrippina was dead, and with her, the last chain restraining Nero's mind had broken. There was now no one left who could control him. But the murder did not strengthen his rule. It accelerated his descent into insanity. The next day, wandering through the palace, Nero claimed he heard voices whispering from the walls, that he saw his mother's face in the dark. For years, he believed Agrippina's ghost visited him in his sleep. He ordered sacrifices in temples, consulted oracles, and sought out magicians to free him from the shadow of his mother. To cover up the crime, the Senate issued a false declaration claiming that Agrippina had plotted against the state. Nero staged an elaborate funeral, playing the role of the dutiful son. But the Roman people were not deceived. Everyone knew the truth. The emperor had murdered his own mother, and that knowledge planted a terror deep in Rome's heart. A man capable of such a crime was capable of anything. The death of Agrippina marked the collapse of Nero's last moral boundary. He was no longer an emperor but the self-made god of his own madness. The palace became a nest of fear and betrayal. Whispers led to death, and the slightest wrong glance could mean exile or execution. The boy who had killed his mother was now master of Rome, yet he would never escape the prison of his own guilt. From that day forward, the Roman Empire would be ruled not merely by Nero, but by the frenzy of his haunted mind. After Agrippina's death, a heavy silence fell over Rome. But it was a silence born of fear. The people now understood that not only the emperor ruled them, but also madness itself. Nero's murder of his mother had erased the last remnants of imperial morality. For the Romans, nothing was sacred anymore. In a world where a son could kill his own mother, no one could feel safe. In the days following the murder, Nero became consumed by his own terror. At night, he flinched at the sound of footsteps echoing through the palace halls and claimed to see his mother's shadow moving in the dark. Servants whispered that they had seen him wake up screaming, shouting that Agrippina's ghost was trying to strangle him in his sleep. Yet even this fear could not stop his craving for violence. It only fed his paranoia and made him more ruthless than ever. A formal decree was soon sent to the Roman Senate. According to the official account, Agrippina had conspired against the state and thus received her just punishment. Nero tried to portray her death as a necessary act for the safety of Rome, but no one believed him. Rumors spread throughout the city. Some claimed that Agrippina had become a goddess, others that her restless spirit wandered Nero's palace, seeking vengeance. From that moment, Nero's rule descended into total collapse. He no longer concerned himself with matters of state or the advice of the Senate. His days were consumed by stage rehearsals, music lessons, and theatrical performances. Rome had become his stage, and he sought to turn himself into a god while transforming his people into his audience. The emperor's new obsession was to replace power with art. He called himself the Light of Rome, sang hymns dedicated to the gods, and recited his own poetry aloud. Crowds were forced to attend his performances, applauding endlessly while he basked in no one dared to leave or even show boredom, for in Nero's theater, even the faintest sign of displeasure could mean death. Nero's obsession with art was more than vanity. It was the evolution of his need for control. As he sensed the love of his people slipping away, he tried to regain it through spectacle and illusion. But to the Roman public, he was no longer an artist. He was a deranged tyrant performing his own madness. During this period, the Senate was rendered powerless. Anyone whom Nero suspected of disloyalty was accused of treason, executed, and stripped of wealth. The imperial court became a stage of blood-soaked intrigue. Friendships dissolved overnight, and a morning greeting could turn into a death sentence by nightfall. The most horrifying aspect of all was Nero's pleasure in the terror he created. Knowing that people feared him gave him a godlike thrill. In Rome, only one law remained: the emperor's desire. The frenzy that began with Agrippina's death would soon culminate in one of the greatest disasters in Roman history, the Great Fire. The flames that consumed Nero's mind were about to devour the entire city. After the Great Fire of Rome, the city lay in ashes, but for Nero, the disaster was nothing more than a new stage. Rome was destroyed, its people homeless, its ancient monuments reduced to dust, yet in Nero's eyes, all of it was part of his divine art. The emperor's focus was not on the suffering of his people, but on the image of himself that would endure through history. His first decree after the fire was not for relief or rebuilding, but for the construction of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This immense palace would rise in the heart of ruined Rome, on the very ground where ordinary citizens' homes had once stood. Its columns would be plated with gold, its walls inlaid with ivory, its ceilings studded with gemstones. In Nero's vision, Rome was no longer the capital of an empire, but the stage of a god. But the people's anger was growing. Many claimed that during the Inferno, Nero had stood on a tall tower, dressed in regal garments, watching the flames as he sang verses from his own poem, The Fall of Troy. Whether the story was true or not hardly mattered. The rumor alone destroyed what little remained of the emperor's reputation. To the people, Nero was no longer just cruel, he was mad, a monster who found inspiration where others found despair. As the accusations mounted, Nero sought a scapegoat. To divert attention from himself, he conceived one of history's darkest fabrications. His chosen targets were the Christians, a small but growing community in Rome. To calm the public's fury, he accused them of setting the fire, and thus began the first great persecution of Christians. Hundreds of innocent people were arrested on charges of insulting the gods and burning the city. Some were thrown to wild beasts in the arenas, others crucified along the roads. The most horrifying were those covered in pitch and burned alive to light Nero's gardens at night, human torches illuminating the emperor's pleasure. According to the historian Tacitus, even the hardened Roman public was shaken by the brutality of these punishments. The people may have despised Christians, but they recoiled from the spectacle of their suffering. Yet for Nero, it was all theater. The screams of the dying were, to him, part of a grand performance. In this way, he tried to transform his sadism into spectacle and his guilt into glory. The fire and the massacre that followed hastened the emperor's psychological collapse. He had lost all grasp of reality. While his people starved and his city still smoldered, Nero threw lavish feasts where food was dusted with gold, and his guests dined among exotic animals and musicians, performing hymns to his greatness. Rome was in ruins, but Nero was staging a rehearsal for immortality. Amid this decadence, Nero's paranoia spun out of control. He began to see traitors everywhere. Among his generals, his advisors, even his closest friends, no one was safe. The philosopher Seneca, once his mentor and the moral voice of his youth, fell victim to the emperor's fear. In 65 AD, the discovery of the so-called Piso conspiracy, whether real or imagined, became the perfect excuse for Nero's next wave of terror. Seneca, accused of complicity, was ordered to take his own life. The old philosopher met his death with calm dignity, opening his veins in a warm bath and dictating his final words to his secretary. The teacher who had once guided a young emperor toward virtue now died, as proof of his pupil's depravity. Each murder left a deeper void inside Nero. No art, no power, no blood could fill it. Only fear remained, the fear he inflicted on others, and the fear that consumed him. The people were beginning to rise, and the legions were beginning to question their loyalty, and the tyrant of Rome, without realizing it, was preparing his own downfall. The man who once made an empire tremble would soon become a prisoner of his own madness. After the Great Fire of Rome, the search for culprits became the darkest chapter of Nero's reign. As the city burned, the people demanded someone to blame, and the emperor, desperate to divert their rage, found his target, the small Christian community of Rome. These people, who refused to worship the traditional gods and held secret gatherings, were already regarded with suspicion. Whether Nero truly believed they were guilty or merely used them as scapegoats, his decision marked one of the most horrific acts of persecution in human history. The Christians were not simply executed in Nero's deranged imagination. Death became a form of spectacle. Some were sewn into animal hides and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified along the Roman roads, and many were covered in pitch and set on fire, their burning bodies used to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. These human torches, lighting the emperor's feasts, became the enduring symbol of his madness. In the darkness of Rome, their flames no longer represented a religion. They became the collective scream of humanity. Even the Romans, long accustomed to blood and brutality, recoiled in disgust. The historian Tacitus wrote that the punishments were seen not as justice, but as a frenzy of cruelty. The people began to realize that their ruler was no longer merely ruthless, but completely unhinged. A man divorced from reason, consumed by his own darkness. Nero's cruelty fed the people's fear, but it also poisoned his power. A year later, in 65 AD, resistance began to take shape. The movement would go down in history as the Pisonian Conspiracy, a desperate attempt by Rome's senators, soldiers, and intellectuals to rid the empire of its tyrant. At its head stood Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a respected statesman known for his dignity, integrity, and devotion to Roman virtue. The conspirators believed that, under his rule, honor and order might return to the empire. Their plan was bold but simple. Nero would be assassinated during the games at the Circus Maximus, and Piso would be proclaimed emperor. But fate and betrayal intervened. A freed woman named Epicharis, attempting to enlist support from naval officers, revealed too much to the wrong man. One of them, terrified of being implicated, betrayed the entire conspiracy to Nero. The emperor's reaction was swift and merciless. Overnight, Rome became a city of fear. Arrests swept through the capital. Confessions were extracted under torture, and guilt no longer mattered. Suspicion alone was enough for execution. Families turned against one another. Loyalty and friendship dissolved in the shadow of terror. Among the victims was Nero's former tutor and moral guide, the philosopher Seneca. Accused of involvement, he was ordered to take his own life. The old man accepted his fate calmly, opening his veins in a bath of warm water. According to witnesses, he tried to embody in death the virtue he had failed to teach his student in life. Soon after, his nephew, the poet Lucan, met the same end. Before dying, he recited verses from his epic Pharsalia, his final act of defiance against tyranny. Nero saw himself as a patron of the arts, yet he was systematically destroying Rome's greatest minds. The city had become a graveyard for thought and a theater for fear. The suppression of the Pisonian conspiracy marked the point of no return for Nero's paranoia. The idealistic young prince who once sought love and admiration was gone. In his place stood a monster terrified of his own shadow, ready to kill anyone who threatened his power. From this moment on, Rome was no longer ruled by an emperor. It was ruled by madness itself. Once a young ruler who had inspired hope with his youthful energy, Nero had now become a tyrant, ruling Rome through fear, excess, and madness. His reign was no longer a government. It was a stage play for his own narcissistic delusions. What had begun as a quest to win his people's admiration through art, poetry, and theater had devolved into an obsession. The man on the throne of Rome was no longer the head of state. He was the lead actor in his own endless performance. Everyone at court trembled before him. The mad emperor who could condemn a man to death with a single word. Senators who dined with him measured every breath, every glance. One wrong phrase or misplaced smile could mean execution. Nero had lost all grasp of reality, convinced he was a divine artist, sent to enlighten humanity. Meanwhile, in the streets of Rome, a different whisper spread. The gods have abandoned us. Nero is our curse. At the height of his insanity, Nero announced his grand artistic tour of Greece, an event that would scandalize the entire Roman world. For a Roman emperor to sing, act, or race chariots before the Greek crowds was not only shameful but a desecration of the sacred imperial office. Yet for Nero, it was not disgrace, it was divine theater. The tour of 67 AD became known in history as the Emperor's Hymn to Madness. From Olympia to Corinth, Nero performed everywhere. He sang, acted in plays, plucked his lyre, and raced chariots. And of course, he won every competition, for to defeat him meant death. The judges, the rivals, and the audiences applauded not from admiration, but from the desperate will to live. Nero returned to Rome with over 1,800 crowns and prizes, genuinely believing the entire world had recognized him as a supreme artistic genius. He no longer wished to be seen as an emperor, but as a god incarnate. While he basked in applause on the stage, the empire crumbled behind him. The legions along the borders grew unruly. Tax revenues flowed into his theatrical spectacles and monumental palace projects, and the treasury was drained. The Roman people were crushed beneath endless taxation. Yet for Nero, the collapse of the state was nothing more than dramatic background. What truly terrified him was not rebellion or ruin, but a bad review. The final blow came in 68 AD. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, raised the standard of revolt. This was more than a military rebellion. It was the first time in Roman history that a provincial governor had openly declared, "I no longer recognize the emperor." Vindex's defiance shattered Nero's already decaying authority. Other governors followed his example, and soon the same phrase echoed across the empire. "Our emperor sings on stage while our cities burn." Nero's response was a grotesque blend of panic and delusion. Instead of mobilizing his armies, he designed stage sets for the punishment of his enemies. He discussed not battle strategy but costume and lighting. He wrote his own victory script, envisioning the battlefield as his stage. But Rome was no theater, and the emperor's play had become one of history's greatest tragedies. When Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania, joined the rebellion and proclaimed himself emperor, Nero's fate was sealed. It was a turning point in Roman history. No one was willing to fight for him anymore. His generals had abandoned him, the Senate's patience had run dry, and the people's fear had turned into disgust. Rome's final tyrant stood alone upon the stage he had built for himself. The man who had dreamed of immortality through art was now destined to live forever in history, not as a genius, but as a monster. Nero's final act was approaching, and when the curtain fell, it would fall in blood-soaked silence.